Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining our session on a topic that we think is very, very relevant for a very big part of the world and really very relevant for the group that has gathered here at IACC looking at issues of corruption and public integrity. And of course, where there's a lot of money, there's a lot of corruption. So we'll be touching on that today. I'd really like to welcome all of you on behalf of Transparency International, the National Democratic Institute, the Open Government Partnership, and the Chandler Foundation, the co-hosts of this panel today. And of course, really thank our panelists and all of you again for joining us. Now, if you're here wondering why we're talking about debt at IACC, maybe I can give you a few facts to put the conversation in context. Recently, the Secretary General of the UN was talking about a report from UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, and he mentioned that 3.3 billion people live in countries where their government spends more on debt servicing than health or education. That's half the population of the world. And that means that basic services are not available to citizens because governments have to pay back loans that they took. And the situation is pretty dire in tens of countries that find themselves in debt distress, and again, where these public services are deprioritized for governments to be able to pay back their loans. Just to give you one example, and I'll pick one country that really stood out among many, Egypt. And Egypt also stood out because they launched an initiative regarding public debt renegotiations and cancellation. But $4 in $10 that enter the coffers of the Egyptian state go to repaying only interest on the loans that they have. That's a tremendous amount of money. And now, of course, as I mentioned, in many places that are facing this debt situation, the governance safeguards to ensure that public debt decisions are made democratically, that is, including the relevant political, policy-making actors, but also civil society, are not there. There are countries where there's still a lot of corruption and so on. And many of these loans are actually not known to the public. That's why we see a lot of conversation these days about opaque debt. Obviously, for an anti-corruption focused crowd, transparency is one key principle in beginning to address any corruption issue, and in this case, addressing sort of the vicious circle of weak governance, increased levels of public debt that we're seeing in many of these countries. And as I mentioned, opaque debt is one of the big contributors to the decisions, the imprudent decisions that countries are making when it comes to their borrowing. And it's something that also leads to unsustainable debt. And this is something we hope to discuss today. One particular note I'd like to make that it's not only that the public is excluded from decision-making around public debt, why debt is contracted, what is the money going to be used for, what trade-offs are being made, but also they're not able to then monitor what happens to the money. How is money being spent? What is the government on the hook for? And actually, what are citizens on the hook for? Because they will be bearing the cost. And oftentimes, even parliaments and oversight institutions, oversight bodies have no visibility and have no ability to hold the government to account. So this has tremendous implications for checks and balances, right? You have, to begin with, weak checks and balances, so governments make these decisions without involving the relevant actors, but this furthers the weak governance structures and kind of locks countries into this vicious circle. So that's what we gathered here today to discuss, and how we turn this vicious circle of opaque debt practices and bad governance into a virtuous circle of accountability. And we have a really stellar panel to discuss today. I'm going to very briefly introduce them, and then we'll move into our discussion. To my left, Ruben Lifuka, who I'm pretty sure doesn't need any introduction. You've seen him also on the opening day, but he's the vice chair of Transparency International and has been for a very long time also involved with Transparency International Zambia chapter, and worked on a variety of these issues. Then Diego Rivetti, who's the senior debt specialist at the Macroeconomics Trade and Investment Global Practice of the World Bank. He's also worked with the IMF before, and he spent really a big part of his career looking at this issue of debt transparency. So thank you for joining us. Next, Jonas Enriquez, who is the senior advisor in the Department for Multilateral Cooperation and Policy in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he works on domestic resource mobilizations, public debt. He represents the country in the Paris Club, and also works on corruption. So thanks, Jonas, for coming. And not least, Daniela Patino-Piñeros from Transparency International Secretariat, who's the program lead for public resources and my partner in crime for this panel and other projects. And with that, if you'll allow me just 2 minutes before I hand it over to our panelists, just a little bit of an advertisement break, if you will, together with Daniela. And National Democratic Institute, NDI, and Transparency International have recently published a new tool for civil society called a Debt Transparency and Accountability Checklist. Now, this is meant to assist various groups in civil society, both organized and informal, if you will, get better information regarding the public debt management, the public debt situation in their country, and understand how their governments are making those decisions, what is the legal framework in place, what is the institutional and operational arrangement, and what different actors are doing, as well as looking in particular at this issue of transparency and the accountability mechanisms that may or may not be in place. So this is meant to be used as a learning tool for CSOs, but also to help CSOs identify the entry points if they wish to engage in public policy discussions with governments, with legislators, even with international financial institutions, to help CSOs design advocacy campaigns and use this in their work to reach out to the larger public, as I think we've seen with partners in Zambia, for instance. So hopefully this is a resource that will help civil society better understand and better engage in the public management, decision-making, and management process, and also engage with each other in a cross-national way. And this is based, if you'll have the curiosity to open, I think my colleague may have left some leaflets there. You can pick one up. There's a QR code and you can access it. But this is based on international standards and best practices that were published by various organizations, including some of the experts that are on our panel today. So with that, thank you for allowing me this short advertisement break. I will turn it over to our panelists and get into the conversation. They will be speaking for roughly 6 minutes each, and then we'll follow up with a round of questions and then open it up to all of you to offer your remarks or questions for the remainder of the time. Okay, so I will first turn to Ruben. Ruben already referenced Zambia. Zambia has been in an interesting debt restructuring situation for the past 3 years. I think there are a lot of really interesting lessons to be learned from the Zambian case about this intersection between opaque debt and good governance and corruption. So perhaps you can walk us through how things went down in Zambia and what are some of the things that we can take away from that experience.
Thank you very much. To begin with, I'm from Africa, and Africa recently has a number of coups taking place. Just in case Ketek Andriana thinks I've taken over a position as TI Vice Chair, no, I haven't. I completed my term last year, November 2023. I'm not too sure I'm still eligible to be TI Vice Chair. So I'm here as IACC Chairperson and also the country lead for Chandler Foundation for Zambia. As you said, Zambia provides lessons both on how to accumulate debt and thereafter struggle to try and restructure the debt. So if you want to know lessons of how we did that, I'll give you a very brief understanding of that. But by way of context, in August 2021, we had a change of government in Zambia. And the new government came into office on a strong promise of, among other things, to restructure the debt. So this is something that they inherited from an outgoing establishment or government, and they focused primarily to try and deal with this. So you see that when you're talking about governance, the government already came in on a strong mandate from the people to try and restructure debt. And they therefore did not see the need to consult widely because it was in their campaign promises. However, there is an interplay between debt governance and anti-corruption. And in our particular case, with the corruption risks that were prevalent before and continue even to date, is that there's been misallocation of borrowed funds. So for Zambia, we acquired Eurobonds, and we were made to believe in 2012 when we acquired the first Eurobond of $750 million, that this would, among other things, go to revamp the energy sector and the rail sector. If you go to the rail sector today, nothing much has been done. Zambia is suffering major load shedding or load management because of a drought that we experienced. And interestingly, even the former minister who was in the position is asking where the Eurobond went insofar as the rail sector is concerned. But these are debts that were acquired without proper consultation. But you also have a situation where without robust domestic oversight, there's a risk of accumulating unsustainable debt levels. And that's what we see in the case of Zambia. Our debt stock rose to $31.74 billion by the end of 2021. This includes interest. So this became out of control and really was a trigger point during the COVID pandemic for the government to default on paying back the debt that they had acquired. But we also see weak debt management regulatory framework. Prior to 2022, the Zambian executive could acquire the debt without parliamentary approval because we didn't have the requirement for Parliament to approve the debt that was procured by the executive. But even the terms of some of the debt, particularly Chinese loans, were not well known, even to parliamentarians that dared to ask in Parliament on this particular matter. But what happened thereafter is that in June 2023, the government reached, in principle, a comprehensive debt restructuring agreement, initially with the official creditor committee, made up of the bilaterals by and large, to try and restructure the debt that Zambia has. But even after that agreement, they needed to work with the private bond holders who are equally important in this scheme of things. And the private creditors can be placed in a number of categories. We have those that are for the Eurobonds that have to be talked to. We have private creditors that government equally has to negotiate with. And there's a third group who acquire treasury bills and bonds from the Bank of Zambia, who again need to be addressed at different levels. Now, so government has been engaged in this debt restructuring process, talking to these different groups. But the discussions are not, of course, open to the public, and neither is government providing adequate information other than announcing that agreements have been reached. And in recent times, they've now announced a little bit on how the restructuring will be done. with the Euro bond holders, indicating that now we're going to have two bonds, Bond A and Bond B, with different terms. But even those terms have not been subject to public discussion. The minister has gone to Parliament to present this new arrangement. But in my honest opinion, and a number of civil society entities have talked to this, we've not had robust discussions on the terms. And I'll give you a small flavor of it. So the two bonds that we now have, because we had a number of Euro bonds, but these will now be restructured into two, Bond A and Bond B. And Bond A essentially matures in 2023, and with a 5.7% per annum coupon payment. And the financial terms remain largely the same as before, as what they call in the base case and the upside case. But it is Bond B which is problematic. Bond B has a best case scenario of interest 0.5% to be adjusted to 7.5% after 2025. But here's a problem with Bond B. The indications from the negotiations is that, let me put it this way, Bond B is worth $1.35 billion, and it is structured in such a way that we can pay over a narrow period of time between 2032 and 2035, or a longer period of time between 2051 and 2053. But this is because of a trigger period. If the economy improves, then we pay Bond B over a short period of time. Now, that's problematic for us. So he's saying, we're going to help you restructure the debt so that your economy improves. You have a bit more headroom to provide development to your people. However, if the economy improves, then you pay Bond B much earlier than 2035. So there's a possibility that in 8 years' time, we could go back into a debt stress that we're currently facing. But these are terms that government has agreed with very little engagement of civil society. So by and large, with the Zambian case, it has taken long. There have been a number of actors, including IMF and the Official Credit Committee, holding out to ensure that we have this comparability in terms of the principles that the private bond holders should equally abide by, but with very little engagement of the citizens. So we've moved from one position of having high debt to a position where we are restructuring with very little engagement of stakeholders, particularly civil society, parliamentarians, among others. And I'm sure there'll be other issues we could talk about.
Thank you so much, Ruben. And indeed, I hope Kay didn't watch our... we reverted you to your former position.
I'm sure she understands.
Diego, let me turn to you now. I think, and we'll have an opportunity to go back and discuss a little bit how perhaps the restructuring process presents some opportunities for more civil society engagement. I think we've seen that case in other countries where civil society has been able to take advantage of that. But I think there's a lot of expectation from civil society that IFIs would have a lot of leverage when it comes to pushing for transparency and more accountability in borrowing countries, and not only. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what the IFIs can do and how to promote transparency and really create those incentives for governments.
Sure. And first of all, thanks for the invitation. So perhaps let me take a step back and start with a definition of that transparency, and then move to what are the incentives for countries, and to be transparent or non-transparent, and then move to how the World Bank and other AFIs can foster that transparency. So as for the definition, that transparency can be defined along two dimensions. The first one is the availability of data. Data that have to be comprehensive, sufficiently granular. They have to cover the whole public sector, not only the central government, and that's a key limitation in many countries. They have to be updated, and they have to be public, publicly available. So that's the first dimension. And then there is a second dimension, which is the transparency of the borrowing process, no? That you mentioned previously. So how legitimate is the borrowing process? Is it based on a sound legal framework that identify who has the responsibility to borrow? What are the instruments that can be used, and so forth? So these are the two main dimensions. And now there is a third dimension, which is the use of proceeds. But that applies precisely to those instruments that has this component, no? So green bonds, for instance, or project financing. It doesn't really apply to Eurobonds, for instance, no? Because typically a Eurobond is issued and the proceeds are for budget purposes. So it's very difficult then to track, you know, how they are spent and to earmark those proceeds. So that's a third dimension that in a way overlap with budget transparency. So I will stick to the first two, availability of data and transparency of the borrowing decision. So why is that important? If you listen to an economist, they would say, well, because if countries are transparent, it will reduce the cost of borrowing. No? Rating agency will appreciate that, and in the long term, your cost of borrowing will get reduced. Which is true. There are many papers that kind of prove that argument. And on the other hand, if you're not transparent, you get punished. Because there is what we call the uncertainty spread. No? If you don't disclose some data that are relevant to the market will believe that you're hiding something. No? There is something fishy, and will kind of punish your government when it comes to issue new debt. So clearly there is a financial incentive to be transparent on the long term, but there is also a moral imperative, no, for government to kind of disclose their borrowing portfolio and irrespective of the financial implication. No? That's for the new generation. Sometimes countries borrow for the next 20, 30, 50 years. No? There are some countries that issue 100-year bond. So there are many generations that are involved in this decision. So if that transparency is so important and has this positive implication, why is that some borrower or lender decide to hide their debt, no? or run opaque transaction? There are mainly three reasons, and I try to sum them up. First, the idea that in short term, avoiding or hiding the disclosure of some debt can have a positive repercussion. No? It can, for instance, circumvent some policies, no? Fiscal rules or policy that are related to your capacity to borrow. And let me give you the example of Greece. No? Before joining the euro, they used to kind of dodge, no? the rules, the fiscal rules, in order to prove that they could meet the Maastricht criteria. And that happens because the statistical framework is not particularly strict at the global level. So we do have standards, but they are not enforced. Now, in Europe, there's Eurostat, but at global level, there's nothing that prevents you to say, I'm not going to publish my debt statistics. You get some repercussion from the market, but technically speaking, 20% of the country in the world don't publish any debt data, and there's nothing that prevents them to do so. So that's one first point. No? So you may want to avoid the higher cost of debt by hiding a portion of it. The second reason is that you want to avoid public scrutiny. And you mentioned, unfortunately, the Chinese loans. There are some evidence that there are some confidentiality clause in some of these loans, and so that's a second reason. And finally, the third reason is just sheer corruption, no? Obtain personal gains. And here I think the classic example is the tuna bond in Mozambique, and that's probably also where all the discussion about transparency started. So these are the three main reasons, or the three main drivers of opaque debt. Or these are those that relate to the intentional lack of transparency. Because on the other side, there is also the unintentional lack of transparency. And let me open a parenthesis on this, because it's very close to my heart. That's what I do for a living. I provide TA to the debt office around the world. And in some countries, in many countries, the situation of the debt office is just very, very bad. like their office, they don't have systems, they are short-staffed, they don't have a clear mandate. So compared to that office in Europe or ACD countries, in many low-income countries, that office don't have a mandate. So it's the president or his advisor that decide to sign a loan. And so that's where it comes to what I call the unintentional lack of transparency. If you don't have a system, if you don't have the information, if you don't receive information about new debt, as a debt office, you cannot produce good statistics, you cannot disclose good data to the public. Let me give you an example. I was a few years ago in Chad, and I give you the example of Chad because it's the first country that actually requested the common framework and received the first treatment by the common framework. In Chad, there is not that office. The office was not even in the Ministry of Finance. It was somewhere in the outside N'Djamena. The people there had 2 or 3 different jobs. There was 1 laptop. And then Chad had this huge loan, 10% of the GDP with Glencore, and nobody at that office could understand how to treat this loan. So that's where transparency also, or lack of transparency, come from. So there's an intentional component and an unintentional component. Let me stop here, and then I move in the second round to the role of the IFIs.
Thank you so much, Diego. And I will note your remark about the lack of global standards and an obligation to report, and the lack of a repository of the information related to public debt that would basically centralize all this information and make it easier for civil society actors and frankly, for parliaments to look at this. But we wanted to get a diversity of opinions here, and bilateral creditors are actually very important in this process, and especially as standard bearers when we look, for instance, by comparison to, as was mentioned here before, Chinese loans that come with so many caveats and confidentiality clauses. So, Jonas, we'd love to hear how you see this issue of debt transparency and accountability from a lender country perspective, and where do you see there are some mechanisms or some entry points to advance this agenda?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I want to thank TI and NDI for putting this important issue of high levels of debt and especially debt transparency and debt management on the agenda at this conference. The number of countries in debt distress or high risk of debt distress speaks for themselves. I think the numbers are 60% of low-income countries in one of those 2 categories. And even if we might have feared that more countries would have gone into debt distress by now, the situation is critical. The amount spent on debt servicing severely limit the country's ability to invest in sustainable development. You mentioned in your introduction, Karina, that 3.3 billion live in countries that spend more on servicing their debt than in education and health. And I think it's actually worse than that. I think what the Secretary General said is that they spend more on interest payments alone than on education or health. And let me add another stat. The World Bank estimates that either countries in 2024 on average will spend more on servicing their external and domestic debt than on their combined public spending on health, education and infrastructure. So the issue of debt transparency can be viewed from different angles. It's obvious that transparency on public budgets and oversight with public spending is a matter of democratic rights, governance and PFM. That alone should be a reason for advocating for increased debt transparency. Specifically from a corruption point of view, hidden debt increases the risk of corruption, as we discussed. If no one knows, no one asks. I would, however, like to focus on another important reason for focusing on strengthening debt transparency and for strengthened debt management at national level as well. It has to do with the potential impact of debt transparency that it can have on debt treatments, and as such be part of addressing the debt challenges that many countries are facing. Different actors around the world are struggling to identify answers to the critical debt situation. Some are looking to the HIPIC initiative from the 1990s for inspiration. The Highly Indebted Poor Countries initiative delivered debt relief to a number of low-income countries. But the creditor landscape has significantly changed since then. While classic creditor countries and the MDBs were behind the bulk of lending back then, new creditors like China, India, and Saudi Arabia, not to forget private creditors, today play a much more important role. So any debt relief initiative would therefore need to include these new creditors. Which brings me to talk about the current setup for debt treatments and the role that enhanced debt transparency can play in delivering better and faster debt treatments. Previously, bilateral debt treatments were negotiated between the debtor country and its bilateral creditors in the Paris Club. With trust built between creditors and a proven model for debt treatments, the creditors could fairly quickly deliver debt treatments. But a cornerstone in debt treatments is the principle of comparability of treatment that you also mentioned, Ruben, or fair burden sharing. All creditors want to ensure that the other creditors are providing a debt relief similar, as no one wants their own debt relief to be bailing out other creditors. So this is one reason for establishing the common framework. Debt treatments in the common framework includes both the classic Paris Club creditors and the non-Paris Club creditors in the G20. It does not include private creditors, but the common framework agreements require that the debtor country ensure that debt treatments with private creditors mirror the effort of official creditors. In other words, that we actually have a framework for debt treatments that ensure participation of all creditors, which would be really great news if it was actually well-functioning and delivering rapid debt treatments. But as those of you that know about the recent and ongoing debt treatments will know, and those that are not familiar with the common framework might have figured, it's unfortunately far from the case. Debt treatments have been slow, and countries are reluctant to apply for debt treatments through the common framework due to the uncertainty that comes with an ongoing debt treatment, limiting their access to new financing and increasing cost of such financing while the debt treatment is ongoing. The good news is that each debt treatment in the common framework seems to take less time, with the new creditor countries needing less time to coordinate internally or for their internal processes. The bad news is that we are not at the point yet where the common framework is delivering sufficiently rapid debt treatments for new countries to actually have appetite to apply for common framework debt treatment. And this is where I see the issue of debt transparency potentially having a key role. Lack of full upfront transparency is a significant factor in the delay of the debt treatments. Without a complete picture of a country's debt, the debt sustainability analysis of the IMF and the World Bank might not paint the right picture of the debt situation, and the IMF program that is a precondition for debt treatment will not be able to identify neither the obligations of the country nor the efforts needed in terms of debt relief from the different creditor groups. So when hidden debt surfaces during a debt treatment, it significantly delays the process. And as mentioned, it eventually results in countries abstaining from applying for debt treatments. Denmark has limited public and publicly guaranteed loans. Our interest in ensuring efficient debt treatments and the solution to the debt challenge the world is facing is not focused on recovering Danish funds. Rather, our perspective is to address the debt challenges to enable countries to invest in the SDGs. We're therefore eager to find solutions, and we believe increased debt transparency would be an important contribution to a more efficient system for debt treatments. Needless to say that we evidently also support the debt transparency for all the other good reasons that I already mentioned. As a strong supporter and promoter of transparency in general, Denmark is all for improving transparency on the side of the creditor countries. But let's be realistic. It's hard to imagine that all new creditors will commit to debt transparency on their side, let alone delivering on such commitment. We must therefore explore all opportunities for strengthening debt transparency on the debtor country side as well. To that end, I'm excited about the work that TI and NDI are doing on improving public oversight to ensure that information on all debt is surfaced and managed. Ensuring that civil society and parliaments have the tools to monitor the debt and debt management is important, both from a rights and a governance perspective, and as argued also for improving the system for debt treatments. We must also consider additional means for increasing debt transparency. One opportunity is exploring how the funding through the World Bank and the IMF could be leveraged to request or push for full debt transparency. I know that the sound of conditionalities might trigger all kinds of reactions, but maybe this could be a condition worth exploring and we could agree on supporting. And just as a final disclaimer, and there are many details in the debt treatments that I haven't touched upon that complicates matters greatly. I think Ruben mentioned some of them in the Zambia case. But my aim is to point to how debt transparency can be an important factor in addressing the severe debt situation that many countries are facing. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonas. And I think that's an important connection to make. I think it's not immediate, especially because the debt conversation is so complex, to see why transparency matters in very concrete terms, especially in countries that are facing debt distress and where renegotiations really rely on this principle of transparency. And on the issue of how to leverage the IMF and World Bank funding and conditionalities, will probably turn to Diego, giving him a pre-warning about this, and perhaps to Ruben too, and see what that situation might be like in Zambia. But last but not least, I'm going to turn to Daniela and really go more in depth in exploring the role of civil society advocacy, both at national but also at global level, and understand what, for instance, a movement like Transparency International can do to advance this agenda and help partners in civil society in the countries that are facing debt distress.
Right. No, thank you very much, Corina, and thank you very much to Ruben, Diego, and Jonas that are joining us today in this panel. It's a pleasure, to be honest, to be sitting here with you and discussing these topics. So just to start, and I want to comment on several things that have been said, but I'll try to stick to my 6 minutes. I want to go a step back because we have started discussing how much our country is paying on debt payments and on interest. But the point of debt and what makes it such a big issue is that it doesn't only impact the generations that we have now, it doesn't only impact the taxpayers and the citizens and the people that are living now, but also it's impacting future generations. So when we see that countries in low and middle income countries are paying in average 30% of their expenditure on debt payments, or 40% in African countries. And then when we see that these resources are not being invested in better infrastructure, in better services, we are seeing, or we are overseeing that in 20 years, in 30 years, as we have been doing in the past decades, we will be discussing of a new debt crisis. I hope not, and I hope that this type of conversations really bring the topic to the table so that we can start closing some of the gaps and the obstacles that we have identified. Diego and Jonas, I really liked your intervention, and Diego, in terms of the implications or the drivers of how corruption can be a driver of opacity in debt. But I think it's very relevant we also talk about the implications. When, as Jonas was saying, when we have opaque debt, when we don't even know how much a country is lending, how much is owing to whom, and under which conditions, there's no way in which we can control and oversee how these resources are going to be used. If we don't even know how much money is entering a country through debt, we don't even know how that money is going to be used. So I think it's very relevant that we bring this topic to the table from a perspective of implications, and we start understanding that debt and that this crisis of debt is a governance crisis, and we have to start discussing this openly and bringing these topics of transparency, accountability, but a stronger anti-corruption provisions as we move forward. Yesterday, we had a very interesting conversation with other people that were participating at the conference, and they were saying, yeah, but we have been discussing of that sustainability for the last 20 years, so why should we discuss it yet again? And then I think some of the things have already been mentioned, but first, we are in an unprecedented moment in terms of the number of countries that are at debt distress or at a high risk of debt distress, but also we're in a changing financial infrastructure. So at this point, we are really having a change in the number of creditors, a change in the lenders, which before was very much, I want to say monopolized, but driven by Paris Club member countries. Now we're having a big role of China, we're having a big role of Russia, and we're having a big role of private creditors that, even though should align with the common framework, as we have seen in many cases, that's not the case. And we can discuss that from Zambia, but we can also discuss that from the restructuring the negotiations in Sri Lanka, in which discussing with the private lenders how to bring these topics to the table was particularly difficult. I don't want to talk more things of what is wrong and the challenges that we have identified, because I think my fellow panelists have already mentioned several, but I just want to bring one that is key. So we were discussing, and I think Ruben also mentioned in the case of Zambia, how one of the challenges was the lack of oversight from the parliaments. Also, Diego mentioned how the lack of capacity of countries like Chad, but also of other countries from the parliaments themselves to oversee and to scrutinize that is one of the challenges. But I also want to bring what Jonas was saying on suprematic institutions and parliaments are not the only oversight actors and stakeholders within a country. And then here, civil society organizations play a key role with this vertical accountability, bringing governments to account, scrutinizing and monitoring the work that we can do. But unfortunately, and going back to this conversation of the 20 years, one of the issues is that first, we're not implementing the standards, but the second is that unfortunately, we're not bringing civil society organizations to the table. We had a very interesting case in Sri Lanka, and we can discuss it probably a little bit more in detail in the next question, in which a coalition of civil society organizations advocated quite heavily to include certain recommendations from a shadow governance diagnosis into the new national action plan after the restructuring of the debt. But this was quite a big movement and quite a lot of coalition and pressure from civil society organizations to just gain a seat in the table and be seen as equals in these conversations with the lenders and creditors. This is not the case in many countries in which we do understand that debt is quite and can be quite a technical issue, as Ruben was explaining, and in which we also not need to generate capacity not only on governments, but also on civil society organizations and on citizens to engage and to actively monitor and scrutinize debt. So just to close, because I think we're running out of time, and we can get excited and discuss this the rest of the conference. But I think there are three main things that we would like to bring to the table besides the active participation of civil society organizations. So I think the first one, and Corinne already mentioned it from this checklist that we have jointly developed and published 1 month ago, we'll translate it also into other languages, which kind of tackles some of the challenges we have identified and have been mentioned by other panelists. So the first one is how we can strengthen legal frameworks so that they include the disclosure and reporting requirements of debt, not only of debt that is being coming from centralized governments, but also including other types of institutions that include but are not limited to state-owned enterprises and other agencies which sometimes are left behind. Also, how these legal frameworks can be very specific in terms of which information do we need to publish. I think the World Bank, the IMF, USAID have very interesting indicators on which information should be published, but this is not being done at the national level, as Diego was also mentioned. In the second hand is how we can operationalize these standards in terms of how we can give teeth to the Debt Management Office, how we can give strength to the parliaments and to other oversight agencies with resources, but also with a mandate of how they can really exercise this oversight. I already mentioned how to strengthen and bring other accountability actors to the table, such as civil society organizations. But I think also, and I'm very happy to hear Jonas, like one of the leader countries in the Paris Club members, that is saying we all, as lenders also have a responsibility, and also from the World Bank, in terms of how we can include conditionalities or other types of provisions to strengthen this transparency and accountability in the way that debt is being negotiated. And just to close, two last things. I think something that was mentioned is how can we strengthen the cooperation between different creditors and lenders. So we're seeing in this changing dynamics within the international financial infrastructure, how we can cooperate in terms of sharing information, in terms of also strengthening the provisions and having the common framework exists, but a broader common framework of which are the provisions we're including. And to finalize, and this was briefly mentioned by the previous panelists, is once we strengthen these provisions, how we can also guarantee that once the money enters the countries, we also strengthen public financial management frameworks. So basically, we guarantee that the budgets are done in a transparent and accountable manner, that we have strong procurement processes, and that, of course, we have all the oversight to really guarantee that the resources are not being lost. But well, pass it back to you, Corina. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniela. And I think we'll come back to I do agree that the Sri Lanka example is really interesting one, and probably a model for how civil society can engage in these complex processes. But I want us to also reflect a little bit, and you mentioned, let's think about solutions. Let's think what can be done. And turning back to Ruben in the case of Zambia, since this process started, Zambia did approve a new Public Debt Management Act, right? So, in which civil society played a really important part, and it opened a conversation about access to information. So do you see any, and I understand these bonds are very complicated and it's still not enough participation, but how do you see the prospects of this conversation and of civil society becoming maybe more involved, more engaged? And what are the good things that are coming out of this whole renegotiation process?
Well, civil society has been engaged in the public debt discourse for a number of years. If you go back to the campaign for debt cancellation, and which led to HIPEC, the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, which Zambia signed many years ago, civil society, a consortium of civil society was engaged in advocating for that, in campaigning for debt cancellation. In recent times, we have the CSO Debt Alliance, whose role has really been to sensitize the general public on the levels of debt and what needs to be done by government. But civil society have been looking at a comprehensive reform, so that you're not just talking of having a Public Debt Management Act, which was passed in 2022, or having the Public Finance Management Act, but we've also been talking about other acts which are relevant, like the access to information. Because you could have these pieces of legislation, but if you don't have access to information, that does not help you. So the access to information law has finally been passed after nearly 20 years of campaign. This new administration has passed that, except that it has not been fully operationalized. So on paper, they'll tell you they've passed a law, but Section 1 of the law says it will come into effect when subsidiary legislation is passed. So that in itself is a limitation. However, we also see advocacy for public procurement reforms, because as Daniela is saying, we need to look at it as a complete package. So civil society have remained active. But as Diego was saying, it's a question of having the right access to information as well. So in the Public Debt Management Act process, we now have a provision for the setting up of a debt management office. However, this has not yet been put in place, and we're anticipating that before the end of 2024, the office could be in place. There's been a bit of periodic publication of debt statistical bulletins. We could ask for more, but at least it has started. We're seeing this on a regular basis. They do publish some debt statistics. And this is mainly on the website of the Ministry of Finance and National Planning. The Ministry of Finance now prepares an annual debt borrowing plan, which is submitted together with the annual budget. But in the views of civil society, we could do with a little bit more information so that our members of parliament really can engage with this plan meaningfully. So in general, there is work that is ongoing. And maybe just to state, you had asked about the role of entities like the World Bank or the IMF. As you know, Zambia has an extended credit facility program with the IMF over a 38-month period. And among the targets that the IMF assesses include areas of restoration of fiscal and debt sustainability, the improvement in debt management and transparency, but also the strengthening of governance and financial stability, as well as the reducing of corruption vulnerabilities. Our only concern is that quite often the IMF comes and gives us an update on where they are in the process of achieving these targets. But I think we need to also have further engagement between the IMF and civil society on whether we are making the right progress. Like I said, it's easy to tick that we have the access to information. But is that working? Is anyone using the access to information? The answer is no. Is government ready in terms of its architecture to deal with requests for access to information? No, not as yet. But insofar as the law is concerned and the principles around access to information, it is there. But the practicality is that it's not yet in full use. So we need further engagement with the IMF, with the World Bank, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that on how IFIs and civil society can collaborate. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Great segue, Diego. Let's return to this point about what the IFIs can do to incentivize countries or maybe to push countries. We've heard the word conditionality from one of our panelists, to push countries to do the right thing, to adopt the right reforms, and then maybe assist with capacity, because you are noting sometimes this is the issue.
Sure. So let me start from what the World Bank is doing, and then perhaps some ideas on how international community can help fostering that transparency. So World Bank is doing three things. First is trying to foster that transparency through its policy, its lending policy. You say concessionality, soft concessionality, meaning countries that want to get 100% of their envelope have to commit to some reforms in terms of, for instance, producing data on SOEs or disclosing data on collateralized debt. So these are clearly related to debt transparency, and otherwise they will get only 90% of the envelope, and the 10% would put aside until they manage to produce this information. So that's one thing, the policy oriented to that transparency. Second thing is technical assistance, and here we are talking about technical assistance to the debt office, but also to the auditors, also the parliamentarians. So it's very much trying to target all the different stakeholders, and it's technical assistance on DSA, on how to produce a debt strategy, how to produce a good statistical bulletin, how to strengthen the legal framework, and so forth. And the third one, we maintain databases. So the largest database on external debt is the IDS. It's at the bank, and it's the largest for the simple reason that every country that wants to borrow from the World Bank has to regularly produce data to the bank, so on an annual basis. And so that's why we have this database that is maintained. It's a huge effort to maintain this database, and now is producing also more granular information. So I think it's a public tool by now. And along with that, we also have some other benchmark tools, like the heat map. So if you want to see how your country performs in terms of data disclosure, you go to this tool. It's very user-friendly. You see the color along the different dimensions, and you see whether your country is transparent or not. So these are the three areas. Is this yielding some result? I would say so, in the sense that when we start engaging in that transparency, I would say 3-4 years ago when we launched the report on that transparency, 40% of low-income countries were not publishing any of that data. Now we are down to 20. And these 20% are pretty much countries that are suffering all type of crises, political crises, conflicts, and so forth. Is this sufficient? Clearly not. We have to do more. And here I would say there are three areas that should be explored. First is this idea of the global repository, that you just mentioned. I think it's an excellent idea whose time has really come, and try to have some form of data sharing between creditor and debtor that is not done through Excel. I mean, to me, it's mind-blogging that still, when the Paris Club has to validate this data, you have this Excel file going back and forth. I think it's probably the last asset in the all international financial architecture that is still managed through Excel spreadsheet. So having a good system, solid, where this exchange of data can be done in a safe way and that allows automatic validation of the information, I think it would really help tremendously that transparency. That's the first thing. Second thing would be trying to take advantage of restructuring exercises, because that's when the country really has to validate its data, has to have a kind of a clean sheet and understand what the exact exposure is. And right now we are not really taking advantage of that. Like, again, going back to the Chad example, they got the debt conditional debt relief from the common framework. Since then, there's been no debt report from Chad. If you go to the website, there's nothing. And it's so easy to include a little clause in the agreement to say, well, you're going to have this relief to the extent that you provide some statistic on your debt to your citizens. So that's something that it's relatively easy to achieve. And the final point is about the creditor's role. No? We keep talking about the borrowers, but in the end of the day, is a joint responsibility, and many bilateral creditors still do not publish any of that data on their lending portfolio. So there are countries that have been really advanced in that area. Like if you go to the U.S. Treasury, they are really keen in producing data on their loans. Other countries that do not. So that's, again, another area that we should definitely explore and see whether we can convince bilateral creditors to produce more data.
Thank you so much, Diego. That's you're really making my job easy, because I'm going to turn to Jonas and ask him to maybe address this question from a creditor country perspective. We've included this piece also in the checklist. We see an opportunity for civil society to engage with creditor countries as well through advocacy, so that where there are limited opportunities to access that information in their own countries, they could then go, to the website, to a public website in the UK or the US, and see what that debt stock actually is. So what are some of the tools that creditor countries can actually use to move this forward, to create more transparency in public debt?
Well, I claim that Denmark is all pro transparency, but I'm actually not sure how to access the data, and I'm fairly sure that it's not all in one side. So you would probably need to look for export credit here, bilateral, whatever is left of bilateral lending here, and so on. So we could probably do better as well. And I think it is an important point, because it's not only about knowing the full picture, it's also about knowing as much as possible to be able to manage and have public oversight on that. So I think we should definitely commit to strengthening debt transparency. We have some through the Paris Club. World Bank is, as you mentioned, working on improving this data. We're supporting that from the Paris Club, but we will not get the hidden debt out there. So we can look at that data, and we've seen research pointing to looking at specific projects and comparing with World Bank data for specific countries where there's a big mismatch. So that's why I pointed to also to the data countries and what we can do to strengthen that side of it. And I'm really eager, as I hope you can feel, for finding ways of making debt treatments more efficient and making it more attractive to countries to actually apply for the needed debt treatments. They're really reluctant to do that. And I think that full transparency or better transparency would really increase that process. It's also about trust between creditors and ensuring the comparability of treatment and all this that I think you also mentioned in Zambia cases is a challenge, in fact. But I think the fact that civil society can play a role and that you're equipping them with tools and checklists building on the tools that already exist from OECD, World Bank, IMF is really positive. Now we need to reflect on how to get that out there, working, identify the champions that will take that further. Excellent.
Thank you, Jonas. Daniela, back to civil society. I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about Sri Lanka and maybe other examples or ideas for how civil society can leverage these pressure points to not only advance transparency in the public financial management system, including public debt, but also broader governance and anti-corruption reforms.
Yeah. No, thank you very much, Corina, for the question. And then I'll start with Sri Lanka, and then I'll go through other examples, because I also have several questions, and I'll try to be very quick, to try to raise to the other panelists. Okay, so in terms of Sri Lanka, as I was saying previously, I think it was a very interesting case in terms of how civil society organizations can influence the restructuring process, as Diego was saying. So I think this year, a lot of things are happening, which can be windows of opportunity or can be challenges. So I think we can try to use it as windows of opportunities. So this year we have 5 countries, if I'm not wrong, that are in process of restructuring their debt. What this opens is a huge opportunity for other actors, such as civil society organizations, but also other actors in the international arena to start rethinking how we can make these processes more transparent, more accountable. And in this line was in which Sri Lanka, and tomorrow our chapter will be discussing, Nadi's there, so I think she would be more, of course, best placed than I am, to discuss how the restructuring happening in Sri Lanka. But basically what the chapter did, led by Nadishani and her team, was to create a coalition with other 100 civil society organizations in Sri Lanka, and basically to develop a shadow governance diagnosis in the country. The IMF was developing the first governance diagnosis in Asia, was developed for Sri Lanka after several restructuring processes of their debt. And then a question that always pops up is, why wait until you're in the 14th restructuring process after you know, because of indicators of corruption and good governance, that Sri Lanka was a captured country? Why do you wait until the 14th restructuring process to decide to do a governance diagnosis? It's something that we need to also bring to the table. And they develop a shadow governance diagnosis in which basically they include a series of provisions of how to strengthen the anti-corruption and the good governance framework within the country. And with help and a very strong advocacy as well from our chapter in the US. So basically the US is one of the major lenders or giving money or funders to the IMF. That's why the role of the US government is highly important in the decisions of the fund. And basically through also advocacy at the national level, and very much aligns with how we can generate advocacy in creditor countries to also advocate for higher transparency and accountability in these issues, we managed to bring these petitions from the civil society organizations to the table. And as I said before, 14 of the 17 recommendations that were submitted in the shadow governance diagnosis made it to the National Action Plan. And something that is key is that, of course, the story does not end here. So it's a huge win for the chapter and for the work they're doing in the country. But of course, this needs to be monitored, and the involvement of the civil society organizations in scrutinizing that these recommendations are being implemented is key. Also, another example, and very quickly, because I think we're running out of time and we'd really like to open for Q&As, happened in Kenya, in which also our chapter, led by Shelia, created a coalition with other civil society organizations and worked very closely with the parliament and passed a Debt Management Act as well to strengthen the role of the parliament in the oversight of debt management. But I'll leave it here for now, and of course, happy to discuss more in detail.
Thank you so much, Daniela. And I think I already saw some hands popping up, so that's really great. Okay, I saw 4. Let's take all of them. Please introduce yourself and tell us which organization you're representing, and please be brief. And we have 25 minutes, but still. So we have 3 here and 1 lady over there.
Okay, as the one lady over here, I get to go first about the looks of things. Barbara Schreiner from the Water Integrity Network, and also a member of the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council of South Africa. Thanks very much for the presentations, very interesting. I'll try and keep my questions short. First, I just wanted to make a comment about the question of increasing debt, indebtedness and the problems of debt, and that relates to the fact that a vast majority of the climate finance is actually in the form of debt. And it is a real concern as to what that is going to do in relation to the indebtedness of countries. And I think it's something that we very seriously do need to look at. I wanted to, Ruben almost touched on it, but it didn't get picked up. And that's the question of blended finance. We're hearing blended finance as the solution to meeting the SDGs, around which there may be questions, but we don't have time for that. But what I would like to understand is, from the perspective of understanding debt, of debt transparency, and of debt restructuring, and of the links to corruption, how is blended finance adding to the difficulties of tracking finance, of of the transparency around finance and of the issues of debt restructuring. Because part of what I was hearing was that the bilateral debt restructuring is a whole lot easier than the restructuring of debt with the private finance, and I've seen it reported in other countries as well. So if people could comment on how blended finance plays into this, that would be interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The lady in the first row, and Franklin, and then the gentleman.
Thank you. My name is Beauty Emefanate. I work with the Ghana Anti-Corruption Coalition. I also host what we call the Economic Governance Platform. This platform was convened in 2016 as a platform to monitor the issues of the IMF in Ghana. And we have done so well in terms of the monitoring. So as somebody said, we invited ourselves to the table, even though we're not invited. And we have made some relevant input through the process up to date. And our story is not too different from what Zambia has shared, because we have to push for a lot of commitment and advocacy. On the issue of access to information, one thing we have found is that it's easier getting information from the World Bank or IMF than from our own governments. And that has to do with the fact that governments always have difficulty churning out information to civil society. Recently, before we even went to the current program that Ghana is under, we could not even agree on what is Ghana's debt stock. There was a lot of debates and disagreements on it. We only got what the real debt stock was when we went under the program. Another challenge we have with oversight has to do with Parliament's role when it has to passing of debts or loan agreements. Most of these loans are taken to Parliament under certificates of urgency, which leaves little time for Parliament to scrutinize and make input into the loan agreements. And when Parliament already has interest of supporting government, most of these loan agreements are passed without scrutiny. So also takes away the part of oversight from Parliament. So what we have done as civil society is to look at how we can also track the debt of government. So we are building what we call a debt tracker to be able to track that. But I do agree, as you shared, that the information is even difficult to assess. It's even difficult to put together and even make meaning out of it for citizens to even understand. But all said and done, I want to understand, why are we not making it a priority for government to put those debts or loans that we undertake into areas that would be of interest and for citizens, especially when debts are used, especially for election years, debts are used on products that will make things that will make government more popular, so that once they are able to get support and votes, so in a way used to buy votes. But can we have a way of getting debts to be more focused, more into service delivery that can benefit the citizens in more meaningful ways than how debts are used, considering that the future would be, the children of the future will be those that will be paying for some of these debts that are being incurred today. Thank you.
Thank you. Franklin?
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Franklin de Vrieze. I work for the Westminster Foundation for Democracy in London. Thank you very much for these introductions, and I want to follow up to the previous question and also to what Diego and Daniela have said with regards to the role of parliaments. So from my observations, I see that in a number of countries, parliaments actually are stepping up their engagement in oversight. We have, for instance, specific parliamentary committees on public debt being established in Kenya, in Nigeria, also parliamentary budget offices in Kenya and Zambia are actually specializing and focusing their expertise on public debt. and that helps parliaments to then scrutinize, debate, and approve, for instance, medium-term debt strategies. However, I think there is also a very strong information disconnect. So with lack of transparency towards members of parliament, for instance, in terms of annual borrowing plans being released to parliaments, which is not always the case, or terms and conditions of loans being shared with parliaments, because, of course, we are facing situations of strong executive dominance, which I think is an issue. Then, of course, parliaments are required to approve the annual budget, but we see that often the annual budgets do not include sufficient information, for instance, on the breakdown of the debt in terms of domestic and international debt, or we see that parliaments approve debt ceilings, but then the executives goes over it anyhow without much consequences. So my questions are actually the following to members of the panel. How do you think Parliament can play a constructive role in bringing more oversight and accountability? And for instance, how do you feel about sharing in-year and mid-year reports to Parliament on the budget execution, including on the borrowing? And also sharing reports with Parliament on the medium-term debt strategy executions and on the implementation of the annual borrowing plan. And then specifically also with regards to lenders, how do you feel about putting transparency to Parliament as an explicit conditionality in any restructuring or in any loan agreements as such?
Thank you.
Thank you.
And there was a gentleman there in the back. If you don't mind, we'll take your question in the next round. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Peter Jonath, PFM specialist. I'll make my questions very short and sweet. Ruben, as Zambia, why did you negotiate in isolation? Why doesn't Africa have a common position through, say, the African Union Commission, where you negotiate as a bloc? Because you're negotiating against a bloc, so why don't Africa actually do the same? And when you negotiate, are you negotiating on a level playing field, or you're negotiating, and I hate to use the word, as a beggar? Because what has changed in the last 20 years from HIPIC to now, where you're renegotiating, the World Bank, I understand you said we're providing technical assistance, we're improving debt management office, we did that in Chad. What has actually happened in the last 20 years that we're looking at the same problem with the same solutions, expecting a different outcome? You know, honestly, it's not about, you know, whether there's greater transparency. We're looking at a system that I think is broken. It's broken in the way it's trying to... We talk about interest payments crowding out government spending on social protection, social issues. But then we say, but governments, you need to pay your interest payments. I think there's something that's really missing here.
Thank you. Great point. And I'm going to turn to our panelists. And the questions were not easy nor short, but I will ask you to please be short if you can. We'll go in the same order because I know there are other questions for the second round. Ruben, is it okay to start with you?
Yeah, let me start with Peter. I wish I knew why Zambia has decided to negotiate alone. They will not allow me in the halls of politics. I'm sure they will kick me out the same day. But there are political considerations, in my view. Like I said, we all have different election calendars or election cycles. We have an establishment that comes in with the idea that they'll deal with the debt crisis. We are talking about the portfolio of lenders having changed considerably with the involvement of China, the involvement of private lenders, etc. And this government has to deliver on its social services and other commitments that it has made. Just for Zambia to get around all the different actors has taken it nearly 3 years. I can only imagine if they were going to do this collectively with other countries within Africa, it could take much longer. But there is potential in Africa developing that common stance and really trying to get others to understand why Africa needs to work on this common basis. And I hope the African Union will play a critical role in rallying everyone together. As matters stand, they're all looking out for their own interests because in the next 2 years, a number of African countries will again be going to elections, and that seems to be the driving force. But I do take your point about the consideration for a common position. And what has changed? Yes, has anything changed? Those are the questions we're asking. With HIPIC, we spent a lot of time on the streets campaigning for that. For us to come full circle, back to an issue of debt stress. And that's why we're worried. If we don't do anything differently, in 8 years, in 10 years, we'll again be sitting around the table and talking about Zambia being debt stressed and so many other countries being debt stressed. Is this a sustainable solution? We need debt restructuring, but does it have the intergenerational equity element? Or we're just doing it for now? Are we looking to the long term? It's something that we also need to consider. Frank, the role of Parliament, I couldn't agree anymore with what you said. Parliament has an important role to play. However, I always say that we make an assumption that parliamentarians have the capacity to engage. If I look at my own Parliament, the Minister of Finance went and read the statement on the comprehensive debt restructuring, which included the 2 bonds that I was talking about. If you look at the debate that ensued thereafter, it was not on the details. It was on the politics of debt restructuring. It was not really to say, is this the right solution? But it was a question of ruling party MPs now saying, you see, you got us into this debt. Those that got us into the debt equally play in politics. So we also have to look at the capacity of parliamentarians. We need to build their capacity. I mean, debt, you the experts here would know is not an easy issue to engage in. And we need to build that capacity of Parliament alongside having parliamentary debt officers and all the relevant public committees of Parliament. I think we need to do more to build capacity of parliamentarians themselves. Just like I would say with civil society, we equally need to build capacity in civil society to effectively engage. My sister from Ghana, I think you made valid points. And I think Diego and my colleague here talked about how we can have soft conditions, as it were. I've seen them coming, like in the case of Zambia, with the IMF Extended Credit Facility, where they're talking about fiscal and debt sustainability, improving debt management. Among the 11 or so recommendations, there are some of those requirements that we need to improve in terms of our system. My only problem is that it is still transactional. We're improving what is already there. It is not transformational to really say, okay, maybe this has not worked. Can we put something in place? We're just trying to clean up with whatever is available. And that's where the challenge lies. The blended question, Barbara, I have experts here. Diego can spend the whole day explaining to us.
Diego,
I think you're passing that question. No, I'm kidding. Let me start from the first question. What happened since HIPIC? I think HIPIC created this, reduced the debt, of most of the low-income countries to very low level. And it created a space for new borrowing. And that space was immediately filled. In 20 years, we have most of the HIPIC countries now back to pretty much the same level of indebtedness as 20 years ago. So is it a problem of debt management, debt transparency? No. No, clearly we should not overestimate the role of debt management. Debt management has an impact at the margin. Here the problem is mainly fiscal. So in the end of the day, I invite you to look at, for every country, at the DSA, the debt sustainability analysis that is published, always have this graph where you see year by year how the debt is generated. So is it growth that is declining? Is the interest rate bill that is going up? Or is it the FX? Sometimes it's because you got your loans in dollars and your currency depreciate, so you have a shock. Or is it because of the banking crisis or a disaster? So you have all kind of reason, and this is nicely summed up in a graph. And you see in most of the cases the reason is fiscal. So just the government that is spending more than what is receiving in terms of tax. So that is just the other coin of the fiscal policy, and that's it. So we should not be blaming that manager for that level of the countries post-HIPIC. So that's the first thing. Role of Parliament, fully agree, and I agree with what you just said. And here, for instance, we do have in our debt management performance assessment is DEMPA, which is a tool that we use. We have an indicator on reporting to Parliament. So definitely we need to have more reporting to Parliament. And we need to have also more reporting to civil society in general. Like in many countries, that office on an annual basis present their debt strategy to the public. And they explain the definition of debt that may not be so straightforward. They explain that statistic, and that's a very good thing to do. It's really best practice. Is it blended finance what really jeopardized that restructuring? I don't think so. Here you have a problem that you have basically 4 categories of stakeholders. You have the bilateral, excluding the bilateral. The multilateral have a preferred creditor status, they're out so far. But you have the bilateral creditors, the commercial creditors, the domestic creditors, and the citizens through, fiscal adjustment. So that's a zero-sum game. Someone has to give, and it's very difficult to find the right balance. No, you have a target that is typically anchored in the debt sustainability analysis. So you have to reach a certain level of debt over GDP, and you have 4 ways of doing it, and that's the bottom line. And here where all the negotiation come from, nobody wants to give more than the others, the bilateral not more than the commercial. Clearly the citizen and the civil society has a role to play in order to avoid that the fiscal adjustment is too strong. So that's where their voice has to be strong and listen. But in the end of the day, it's a zero-sum game. And that's the problem.
Thank you, Dio. Jonas, do you want to take any of the questions?
Yeah, great questions, thanks. First of all, on the transparency requests to what lenders can do to request transparency when it's really my question. I sneaked into the panel to get the response or to get the assessment from one of the most important lenders. We as bilateral creditors, we have limited leverage. I'd say we might have some publicly guaranteed loans that we could include some clauses, but I think it's when you have the budget support with reform requirements. I think that is where I could imagine, at least. Not to say that we could not all be pushing for it. So I think it is really a relevant point, and I think your point on Ghana on how debt that was unknown was disclosed or came up during the process is exactly what I'm talking about. It is complicating things. It is extending the processes, and so that is. I totally agree. It's a relevant comment. I'm not. I think on blended finance and how that adds to the complexity in case of debt restructurings. It might, but I think it's also, and then to your other point about the climate financing, that is also very much of it we are planning or hoping to mobilize is in form of loans that then is new debt. And of course it is an issue, but I think we should also be cognizant that the debt is not bad in itself. It's very much about the character of loans, the conditions, interest rates, and so on. We need funding. We all do. All our countries need funding. So it's about knowing the country's situation, the fiscal ability to take up more loans. And there are things that are less evident to finance through loans, like climate adaptation, for instance, where there's no profit down the line, for instance.
Yeah. Thank you. Daniela, a quick response on any of the points?
Yeah, sure. Very quickly, I think on the role of parliaments, and NDI and you have also published quite a lot on the role of parliaments on debt management and on debt transparency. But I would like to go to something you mentioned when you were discussing on Ghana and was on the issue of urgency. No? So there was a study that was recently published by the IMF that doesn't speak about urgency, but it speaks about the lack of rules or a legal framework that defines confidentiality. And then I think we can do the same with urgency, and we had quite a lot of examples during the pandemic in which a lot of governments tried to use urgency as an excuse to implement a series of exceptional provisions that were necessary in some cases, were not necessary in others, but this opened a lot of discretions and opportunities for corruption. And then I think it goes back to our point of how we can strengthen the legal frameworks and start establishing, okay, if it's urgent, what means that it's urgent, and how you can limit as much as possible the discretion of the policymakers and the decision makers in terms of that. And just to give a very quick example, not specifically on that, but on public financial management, our chapter in Malawi, actually, through advocacy, through some of the projects that we had, managed to change the law in terms of what was the time that parliaments had to approve the annual budget, which was before, if I'm not wrong, it was 10 days, and then they could increase it until 20 days, basically to give the parliament enough time or more time to review in detail the annual budget that was being presented. So I think this is a good example from, not specifically from that, but from public financial management that we can bring to the table and see how through advocacy we can change these provisions. And on the role of parliaments, we have also discussed, we always give a huge role to parliaments, which they have. They have the mandate to oversee and to scrutinize that in many cases. But I think also civil society organizations we have discussed, but as well supreme audit institutions are starting the conversation of how through audits they can also see the performance not only of money coming from debt, and very much aligned with what Diego was saying with this perspective of fiscal policy, but how all the resources from the state are being used and which are the impacts they're having. So I think probably a conversation for another panel of how these other oversight institutions can also play a key role in terms of overseeing and monitoring them.
Thanks, Daniel. Okay,
no,
sorry.
No, very quickly on the issue of blended finance, which I think it's a key question. I'm not going to start discussing in detail because I think Diego and Jonas already covered it, but I think in terms of climate finance, and I don't have an answer, but it's more a question as well, there are starting to be several conversations on different proposals from different governments in terms of climate debt swaps. And what we're seeing is that in many cases, countries that are very vulnerable to climate change are in many cases also very vulnerable or are high risk of debt distress. So I think it's also a conversation we need to bring in the table, not if we agree or not with climate debt swaps, but in terms of how do we establish the provisions and the frameworks to guarantee or to reduce the loopholes for corruption and for opacity.
Thank you. We have less than 3 minutes, and I know there's at least one other question, so please be very, very quick. The gentleman in the back.
Thank you all, guys. My name is Amin from Tehran Chamber of Commerce and from Iran. Listening to you guys and seeing that title, I was thinking about something like this. Is debt the symptom? Yeah. Okay. Is the debt the symptom or the root cause? I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about the democratic oversight. Let me tell you something. When a populist government is got elected in a country, all of us can be sure that the debt will be increased, and the government expenses has a skyrocketing effect on the government expenses. Let's look at the U.S. as a perfect example of a great liberal democracy, and all of us can be sure if someone like Trump will be got elected, and the debt of the U.S. government and the budget deficit will be increased. What can we do about it? Listening to all the guys, we are talking about the controlling the damage, not the mitigating the risk. Is there anything we can do about it or not? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other question? This is your last chance. Yes, please, but please be very brief.
Thank you. John Hawkins from COST, the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative. We've started to develop some data points around public investment management connected to procurement and contract implementation, which will be additional modules to the Open Contracting for Infrastructure Data Standard, because we know public investment management and how projects are selected related to these loans is critical in terms of debt transparency. So from your perspective, what do you see as the kind of top 2 or 3 pieces of information that civil society needs to understand public investment management and how these infrastructure projects, where the loans are coming from, meant to be invested in, will help to understand what's happening and reduce corruption?
Thank you very much for the brevity. 20 seconds each to respond to any questions and make your final remarks. Leave us with a capstone thought, if you like. Daniela, I'll start with you.
Okay, yes.
Start from the other side.
Okay, 20 seconds. Okay, I'll try to do it very quick. And sorry, John, I cannot answer your question because I only have 20 seconds, but I'll give a promotion, actually, of this checklist for civil society organizations that we have published 1 month ago with NDI, and in which basically we define all of the disclosure points, taking also from tools that already exist from the Debt Bank, from the IMF, from USAID, and from others, establishing which should be those data points or data disclosure points that civil society organizations should focus in to advocate, basically to monitor and scrutinize that.
Thank you. Jonas?
Yeah. No, well, thank you. I didn't attend any of the cost sessions, but I was really interested in it because it's so much about infrastructure investments, and much of the hidden debt is out there as in form of a project that has been financed with a loan that we don't know about, and we can't assess the cost if it's reasonable. Is there corruption likely in that? So I think it's really interesting. And I think the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which I know more about, is like setting up a system on transparency on licensing, contracting, or financial flows. I think so. It's a really important initiative without knowing the content of what you do. But I think you might actually be able to reveal some of these issues here. Thanks.
Yeah, please.
Perhaps I take the question. I like the way you put it. I think that is more a symptom. Is there a way to commit government over time? There are ways to try to do it through fiscal rules, the golden rules in some countries. Then whether it works or not, it depends. I mean, the government may just decide to reform the fiscal rules, so how stable they are. There are plenty of papers that discuss those, and that's probably the way to kind of limit, this what you're saying, the fact that a new government come in and they just decided to run on a spending spree. On the information missing, I think what is missing, in my view, is this link between the size of the loan and the actual project implemented. So we may know the terms, we know that the loan is concessional, we know everything about the loan value is 100, the value of the project may be 80. And so, this mismatch may be there, and it's critical. We don't know, and we have very little way to kind of understanding, assess it. That would be amazing if we can, manage to find that link and some information about value of the project against disbursement of the loan.
Well, the role of civil society is still very critical, even in situations where you have populist leaders taking office, because civil society, if well capacitated, can advocate for necessary changes, they can educate the general public, they can campaign for changes to laws or institutions, and most importantly, they can also engage government in ensuring that debt transparency works for the greater good of the general populace. Thank you.
And that is a great note to end on. Thank you very much, Ruben. Thanks to all of you for your excellent points. Thank you for your insightful questions and for sticking with us 3 minutes late. Thank you all very much.